Benjamin Netanyahu, prime minister, diplomat, soldier, even, I can't believe I'm saying this, a little bit MIT. His story, well, it's anything but ordinary. And today, we're diving deep, like really deep, into the career of this, let's just say it, controversial leader.
Trying to figure out the man behind all those headlines.
Exactly. What makes him tick? And, maybe more importantly, what will his legacy be?
That's the real million-dollar question, isn't it? Because we're not just talking about one man's life here. It's bigger than that. We're talking about how his choices, good or bad, have shaped, really shaped, Israel's destiny.
And where better to start unpacking all of that than with, the early years?
Right, the foundation.
Because this isn't your average kid growing up in Jerusalem.
Yeah,
Netanyahu's family, they split their time between Israel and the U.S. Talk about a crash course in, cross-cultural living.
Oh, absolutely. Navigating two worlds, two completely different sets of values. That experience, I think, gave him a perspective you just don't get otherwise. A perspective that definitely served him well later on, especially in his diplomatic career.
Right. Makes sense.
But, of course, his childhood wasn't all,
Yeah, it wasn't all sunshine and roses.
not exactly. His brother, Yonatan.
The Operation Entebbe raid?
Yeah.
Tragic. Just tragic. For those who maybe don't know the story, this was Israel going, thousands of miles?
Yeah.
To Uganda to rescue hostages. Can you imagine the impact that event, that heroism, but also that profound loss had on a young Benjamin Netanyahu?
Oh, without a doubt. It's one of those defining moments,
Yeah.
the kind that shapes who you become. Suddenly, the issue of security, it's not theoretical anymore. It's personal. It's visceral.
Yeah.
And honestly, that theme, that focus on security, it echoes throughout his entire political career.
And it's not just talk, right? This isn't some politician who's never seen the front lines. Netanyahu served in the military, and not just any unit. We're talking Sayeret Matkal.
Israel's most elite special forces
Yeah.
unit, the best of the best.
Exactly. I was reading that Netanyahu actually said, and I'm paraphrasing here, but basically that serving in that unit gave him this deep, almost instinctive understanding of the risks of military operations.
Which makes sense.
Right. It's one thing to read about it in a briefing. It's another to have lived it.
Completely.
Yeah.
And, that perspective, it becomes all too real later on when he's the one authorizing missions as prime minister. Suddenly, he's not just thinking about strategy, he's thinking about the human cost,
Yeah.
the families, the weight of those decisions. It has to be immense.
Absolutely. But, and maybe this is just me, it also makes his later decisions, to engage in or even escalate certain conflicts all the more, controversial even,
Definitely. There are a lot of opinions about that.
to say the least. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. Before we get to all of that, we've got to talk about his rise in Israeli politics. Talk about a meteoric rise. Ambassador to the UN, leader of the Likud party. It's like something out of House of Cards, but, in the Middle East.
And this is where understanding the political landscape in Israel is so, so important. The Likud party, it's always represented a more, shall we say, right-wing stance. Strong national defense, a firm position in negotiations, that's their bread and butter. And Netanyahu, he's got this charisma, this way of articulating those views that really resonated with a huge chunk of Israeli society.
And by 1996,
Youngest prime minister in Israel's history.
it's wild, but it's also, like they say, the higher you climb.
The further you fall.
Exactly.
And fall, he did, at least for a while.
Mhm.
But even before that, his first term as prime minister, it's fascinating. You can already see the tightrope he's walking, trying to balance all these different pressures.
What do you mean? Give me an example.
Okay, so on the one hand, you've got the Wye River peace talks. A genuine attempt, however flawed, at finding some kind of path forward with the Palestinians.
Right, a glimmer of hope.
Exactly. But then, in the same term, what does he do? He decides to open a tunnel near the Western Wall.
Which might not seem like a big deal to some,
But to many Palestinians, it was a huge provocation.
Mm.
And riots erupted, tensions exploded. It's like this stark reminder of just how delicate the whole situation is in that part of the world.
And how even the smallest actions can have huge consequences.
Oh, absolutely. And, it raises this question that's going to follow Netanyahu throughout his career. Was this a miscalculation? A rookie mistake?
Mm.
Or was he, and this is the question, right? Was he just stuck between a rock and a hard place, trying to keep everyone happy, trying to appease different factions within Israel?
It's a question that definitely doesn't have an easy answer. But, and this is what I find so fascinating about Netanyahu, it's not just about peace talks and political maneuvering. The man's been called both an economic miracle worker, AND, accused of being way too harsh with his policies. Some people even call them Thatcherite. Can you believe that? So which is it, miracle worker or heartless economic reformer?
Well, let's just say that during his time as finance minister, he definitely wasn't afraid to shake things out.
What do you mean?
Privatization, deregulation, tax cuts. If you're thinking free market, you're on the right track.
The classic trickle-down economics.
You got it. And here's the thing. The Israeli economy, it boomed.
So, problem solved.
Well, not quite.
What do you mean?
This is where the whole miracle worker thing gets a little tricky.
Mm.
See, critics argued that, sure, the economy grew, but who really benefited? Was it everyday Israelis? Or was it, as they say, the rich getting richer?
Ah, the age-old debate. The role of government. Protect the little guy or unleash the power of the free market.
A debate that's been going on for centuries, and it plays out in a really intense way in Israel, given its history and the whole social dynamic there.
And Netanyahu. Whether he meant to or not, he's right in the middle of it all. It's almost like, depending on who you ask, you're looking at two completely different economies within one country. But speaking of complex relationships, can we talk about the U.S. and Israel? I mean, Netanyahu in the U.S., it's like watching a political drama unfold. Alliances, disagreements, backstabbing, even some, shall we say, colorful language exchange behind closed doors.
It really shows you how global politics actually works. Yeah, the U.S. and Israel, they share interests, they share values, but even with all that, there's going to be friction, especially when you're dealing with issues as, well, let's be honest, explosive as the Israeli-Palestinian conflict or, Iran's nuclear program. Those are not easy things to see eye to eye on.
And Netanyahu, you have to give him this. The man does not shy away from those issues. When I was reading about his stance on settlements, I was struck by how, and this is a direct quote from him, he said they're not an obstacle to peace. He actually sees them as, get this, a vital part of Israel's security.
Which, you have to understand, it's a perspective rooted in history, a very specific reading of history that emphasizes all the threats Israel's faced.
Right.
From day one, basically. And that same perspective, it also explains his stance on Iran. I mean, he sees Iran as, and these are his words, an existential threat because of their nuclear ambitions. And that's where you see, Netanyahu, the orator, the statesman, going on the world stage, talking to Congress, trying to get everybody on board with his point of view.
It's amazing. Certain figures, they just have this way of commanding attention. Even if you completely disagree with them, you can't help but listen.
It's true.
But, and maybe this is just the cynic in me, it's not just about policy and international relations, is it? Even someone as seemingly untouchable as Netanyahu, their personal life, it becomes public.
Oh, yeah. What they eat, who they marry, how they,
It's all fair game.
Exactly. Like that whole story with his wife and the nanny.
Don't even remind me. Fired over a 15-second phone call.
Seriously.
Hey, I'm just saying, it just shows you when you're in that position, that spotlight, it's always on. And honestly, in a weird way, I kind of get it. Think about it. When you're talking about a leader, their judgment, their temperament, it all matters.
Because it's not just about them, right? It affects everybody.
100%.
Which, in a roundabout way, brings us back to that question of legacy, peacemaker, hawk, economic reformer, Netanyahu, he's been called all of those things, and more, probably. So how do we even begin to reconcile those different sides of him? If I had the answer to that, I'd probably be, I don't know, writing a book or something. The truth is, it's tempting to want to put people in these neat little boxes.
Right.
But real life, especially when you're talking about someone like Netanyahu, it's way more complicated than that.
That's for sure.
And, what makes it even more interesting, his story's not over. He's back in power after being, ousted. That just adds another layer to this whole thing.
Right. Like, how do you even begin to write the ending when the story keeps changing?
Exactly.
But there are certain chapters, certain events that really stand out. And one that I kept coming back to was his whole back and forth with the ICC.
Well, the International Criminal Court. Yeah, that's a whole other can of worms.
Because it wasn't just about disagreeing with, the prosecutor wanting to investigate potential war crimes. Netanyahu, he went on the offensive. He was not backing down. He actually called it an attack on Israel's right to defend itself.
Which, you have to understand, from his perspective and the perspective of a lot of Israelis, they see it as a sovereignty issue.
Because Israel's not even a member of the ICC, right?
Exactly. So from their point of view, this is an international body trying to, impose its will on a sovereign nation.
And Netanyahu, he wasn't having it. He actually sanctioned ICC officials. Which, I mean, that's a pretty bold move. It shows you, this is serious.
Okay.
So what does that tell us about him as a leader? Is it pragmatism? Like he's just doing what he thinks is best for his country no matter what? Or is it something more? something, I don't know, more assertive, maybe even defiant in the face of all that international pressure.
Well, that's the million-dollar question.
Right, and it's one that people have very strong opinions about. I mean, his supporters, they love it. They see it as strength, as him being a true defender of Israel. He's willing to stand up for what he believes in, even if it means going against the grain.
And his critics,
Well,
they probably see it a little differently.
like just a tad.
Yeah, a tad. They might say he's too confrontational, that his approach just makes things worse.
Which is unfortunate because, let's be real, the situation over there, it's already volatile. I mean, you look at the recent conflict with Hamas in 2023, that was devastating. Just utter devastation on both sides.
Absolutely.
And again, you see those divisions, people calling for Netanyahu to resign, saying that his policies made everything worse. But at the same time, you have people rallying around him. They see him as like this rock, this symbol of strength during a crisis.
It's incredible. The same person, the same events, but such different interpretations.
Which I think, and maybe this is too simplistic, but I think it all comes back to that fundamental question. Who is Benjamin Netanyahu? What does he really believe?
Because he clearly evokes very strong reactions in people, positive and negative.
Oh, for sure.
And the fact that he's been able to navigate all of that, to stay in power for so long, it says something.
It definitely does. And speaking of strong reactions, we'd be remiss if we didn't talk about that comment he made. You know, the one about Palestinians being, and I'm quoting here, collateral damage during the recent war?
Yeah. Not his finest moment.
To say the least. I mean, people were outraged.
Rightfully so.
I mean, to accuse someone of dehumanizing an entire group of people, that's about as serious as it gets.
And even though he tried to walk it back, you know, saying he was talking about Hamas using civilians as human shields. But once you say something like that, the damage is done.
Right, you can't just put the toothpaste back in the tube.
Exactly.
It's a tough lesson. Words matter, especially in a situation as volatile as that.
100%.
But more than that, it highlights, again, how divided we are on this. Like, the article mentioned that when Netanyahu addressed Congress asking for support, there were protests. Over 200 arrests. That's insane.
It's a reminder that this conflict is not just some abstract thing happening over there. It's real people, real lives, real pain. And those emotions, they run deep.
And that's ultimately what makes this whole thing so heartbreaking. Because you have a leader, Netanyahu, who's clearly intelligent, experienced, driven. But this one conflict, this one issue is like this impossible puzzle he can't seem to solve.
It really makes you wonder, what will it take to find a lasting peace? What will Netanyahu's role be in all of that?
Because, let's be honest, his track record, it's not great.
That's one way of putting it.
But maybe, just maybe, there's still time to change the narrative, to find a way forward.
Let's hope so.
You know, it's funny you say that about finding a way forward, because when I think about Netanyahu and his whole approach, not just to the conflict, but to things like, you know, economics, it's like he always goes for the most, I don't know, straightforward solution, even if it ruffles some feathers along the way.
Interesting.
Like, he sees a problem, he wants to fix it, no drama.
Which, I mean, that can be a good thing, right? Decisive leadership.
Right, exactly. But it also makes me wonder, and maybe this is a stretch, but did his time at MIT studying architecture, of all things, did that, like, influence how he sees the world?
What do you mean?
Well, architecture, it's all about structure,
Right.
Systems. Maybe in his mind, he's not being ruthless. He's just, I don't know, applying the most logical solution, even if it's not always the most, shall we say, emotionally sensitive one.
That's a really interesting way of looking at it. And it makes you think, you know, all those years honing those problem-solving skills in such a technical field,
Yeah.
did that shape how he approaches the much messier world of politics?
Right, because let's face it, politics, it's not exactly known for its clear-cut solutions.
Definitely not.
But maybe, in Netanyahu's mind, it is.
That's what makes him so fascinating.
Yeah.
Right? You can never really pin him down.
Yeah.
Is he a pragmatist? An ideologue?
Yeah.
A combination of both. It's hard to say for sure.
It really is. And that's why, you know, even after all this time, after all we've learned about him, his legacy, it's still very much up for debate.
Because on one hand, you have this incredibly skilled politician, someone who understands power, who knows how to get things done.
Right. He's been called a political magician, a chess master.
Exactly. But on the other hand, there are those who say, you know, he's too focused on holding on to power, that he's not willing to take the risks necessary to achieve a true, lasting peace.
And that's the million-dollar question, isn't it? At the end of the day, what matters more? The legacy or the results?
And who gets to decide what that legacy even is? It's something I keep coming back to, especially with someone like Netanyahu, whose story is so intertwined with the story of Israel itself.
It's almost like, and maybe this is too dramatic, but it's like he's become this symbol of the hopes, the fears, the contradictions of an entire nation.
Which is a lot of weight for one person to carry.
That's for sure. And as we wrap up this deep dive, I keep thinking about that young man serving in the military, seeing firsthand what conflict really means.
It's easy to forget, with all the politics, all the headlines, that there are real people at the heart of all of this.
Absolutely. And ultimately, that's what we have to remember. That's what's really at stake, the human cost, the lives lost, the families torn apart.
Because peace, it's not just a word on a piece of paper. It's about creating a world where those sacrifices, those losses, they never have to happen again.
Well said. And on that note, that's our deep dive into the life and career of Benjamin Netanyahu, a man who is both admired and reviled, often in equal measure.
A man whose story is still being written.
Exactly. And one that will continue to be debated, analyzed, and, dare I say, deep dived into for generations to come.